The night air over the Nile was still warm long after the sun had disappeared behind the western desert. Heat stayed trapped inside the mud brick walls of the village, slowly drifting back into the darkness as families settled into another quiet evening beside the river. The sky above ancient Egypt was wide and deep, filled with stars that seemed brighter than lamps. Far away from the noise of cities and temples, small villages rested along the black fertile earth beside the water, surrounded by silent fields of barley and flax. At this hour, most of the labor of the day had finally ended. The fishermen had pulled in their last nets before sunset. Farmers had carried their tools home across dusty paths. Potters had stopped their wheels. Bakers had removed the final round loaves from clay ovens glowing with fading heat. Donkeys stood quietly beside walls of packed earth, their sides slowly rising and falling in the warm dark. And little by little, the sounds of daytime Egypt disappeared. The villages did not become completely silent. They were never truly silent. Even deep into the night, there were always soft noises moving through the darkness like slow river water. The ancient world breathed gently after sunset. A narrow road stretched between rows of low homes built from Nile mud and straw. The walls were rough beneath the fingers. Some homes were small enough for only a single family sleeping together on woven mats. Others held grandparents, children, cousins, goats, baskets of grain, and sleeping chickens all under one roof. Flat rooftops collected the cooling night air, and many villagers climbed onto them after dark to escape the trapped heat inside the rooms below. The sound of sandals scraping softly against dry stone could still be heard here and there as neighbors finished small evening tasks. A woman poured water from a clay jar into shallow bowls. Somewhere farther down the road, a tired man coughed heavily after breathing dust all day in the fields. A baby cried briefly before being comforted back into sleep. Then the village settled again. The Nile moved quietly nearby. At night, the river became darker than the sky itself. In the daytime it flashed with sunlight and movement, crowded with boats carrying grain, fish, reeds, stone, and workers. But after sunset, the water slowed into shadow. Gentle ripples touched the muddy banks. Papyrus plants swayed faintly in the warm breeze. Frogs called from the reeds in soft repeating rhythms that echoed through the darkness. For many villagers, these sounds were as familiar as breathing. Children born beside the Nile fell asleep listening to water brushing against riverbanks. Old fishermen woke during the night and listened for the movement of boats drifting downstream. Farmers could tell the direction of the wind simply by hearing how the reeds rustled after midnight. The night had its own language. In one small home near the edge of the village, an elderly baker rested beside a low wall with his feet stretched into the cooler air. His hands were rough from years of grinding grain and lifting clay jars of water. Even now, long after work had ended, the smell of warm bread still clung to his skin and clothes. Inside the house, his daughter quietly swept dust from the floor with a bundle of reeds. The movement was slow and steady. Soft scraping sounds moved across packed earth. Nearby, two children already slept side by side beneath a thin linen cloth, their breathing calm and uneven. The baker listened to the village. He heard insects humming in the darkness beyond the walls. He heard distant footsteps fade along the road. He heard the wooden creak of a fishing boat shifting gently against its rope by the riverbank. Then, after a while, he heard almost nothing at all. This was the hour many Egyptians waited for during the hottest seasons. Daytime in the villages could be exhausting beyond words. The sun pressed heavily onto rooftops, fields, workshops, and narrow roads from morning until late afternoon. Men and women worked beneath endless heat while dust clung to sweat-covered skin. Workers bent over irrigation channels. Laborers carried stone, baskets, or jars across uneven ground. Scribes sat in cramped rooms copying records while flies drifted lazily through still air. By nightfall, bodies ached. The quiet darkness became a kind of relief. Many villagers stayed awake longer than one might expect, simply because the air finally became bearable after sunset. People spoke more softly at night. Their movements slowed. Conversations drifted lazily between rooftops and open windows. In one corner of the village, several women sat together outside a home beneath a hanging oil lamp. The flame flickered gently whenever the breeze passed through. One woman repaired a torn fishing net while another peeled garlic cloves into a shallow bowl. They spoke quietly about grain storage, about a neighbor recovering from illness, about whether the river might rise well this year. Their voices blended softly with the nighttime insects. Close by, a skinny brown dog wandered through the road searching for scraps. Its paws made faint tapping sounds against packed dirt. The animal paused near a doorway where cooking smells still lingered in the warm air. Lentils. Onion. Fresh bread. Fish cooked earlier beside glowing coals. Most meals in Egyptian villages were simple, but after long days of labor, even simple food brought comfort. Bread remained at the center of nearly every table. Some loaves were coarse and dark, filled with bits of stone left behind from grinding grain between heavy millstones. Others were softer and lighter for families with more wealth. Beer brewed from barley sat in clay jars beside nearly every meal, thick and cloudy but filling enough to sustain workers through exhausting days. At night, after eating, many villagers simply rested together without speaking very much. The darkness itself encouraged silence. Above the village, stars stretched endlessly across the sky. Without bright lamps or city fires, the heavens appeared enormous. Egyptian farmers often woke during the night and looked upward before returning to sleep. The stars helped guide seasons, floods, planting cycles, and religious ceremonies. Priests studied them carefully. Sailors trusted them. Ordinary villagers simply lived beneath them every night of their lives. Sometimes a breeze traveled in from the desert. It carried dry warmth over the rooftops and through narrow alleys. Palm leaves rustled faintly. Hanging cloth shifted in the dark. Sleeping children turned quietly on woven mats as cooler air finally touched their faces. In larger villages, there were still a few signs of activity long after midnight. A temple guard might slowly patrol near a storehouse filled with grain. His sandals brushed softly against stone while a small lantern swung beside him. Somewhere near the edge of the fields, workers responsible for irrigation channels sometimes stayed awake to monitor water flow. During flood seasons especially, the Nile demanded careful attention even at night. But most people slept. And sleep in ancient Egypt came heavily. Workers often rose before sunrise when the air was coolest. Farmers walked into fields while stars still hung overhead. Bakers began grinding grain in darkness. Boatmen prepared ropes and nets before dawn colored the eastern horizon. Because of this, nighttime villages carried a deep tiredness. You could almost hear exhaustion resting over the rooftops like another layer of heat. Inside many homes, families slept close together for comfort and space. Houses were small, and airflow mattered more than privacy. Some people slept on reed mats directly on the floor. Others rested on simple wooden beds raised slightly above the ground. Linen sheets, if a family owned them, felt cool against skin damp from the humid river air. Mosquitoes drifted near standing water. Occasionally someone slapped at their arm half asleep before settling again. Far away, jackals cried from the desert edges. The sound traveled thinly through the darkness, eerie but familiar. Villagers paused when they heard it, though not with fear. These nighttime cries belonged to the landscape as much as the river itself. Ancient Egypt was never separated from nature. The villages sat between fertile farmland and endless desert, between life-giving water and vast empty silence. Night revealed all of it together. A young fisherman sleeping beside the river suddenly woke sometime after midnight. Perhaps it was the shifting rope of a nearby boat. Perhaps it was only the heat. He sat up slowly, rubbing tired eyes while moonlight reflected dimly across the Nile. The village behind him remained mostly dark. He could make out low rooftops and sleeping animals beside walls. A few tiny oil lamps still glowed faintly through doorways where someone remained awake caring for a sick relative or finishing household work delayed by daytime heat. The fisherman listened carefully. Water touched wood. Reeds brushed together. Somewhere nearby, another man snored softly beneath a cloth canopy. The fisherman drank a little water from a clay jar and looked toward the eastern horizon where morning would eventually arrive. But not yet. The night still held the village gently in its quiet grip. He lay back down beside his rolled net. For a while, clouds drifted slowly across the stars. In wealthier households farther north near larger towns, nighttime sounded slightly different. More servants moved through larger rooms. More animals occupied courtyards. Storage jars lined cool walls. Lamps burned longer. Yet even there, once the business of the day ended, the same deep stillness slowly arrived. The sounds of sandals faded. Doors closed softly. Voices lowered. The ancient world rested. In poorer villages, the silence could feel even deeper. Without many lamps or large gatherings, darkness covered everything quickly after sunset. Families conserved oil carefully. Most homes became shadowy shapes beneath moonlight, their walls pale and dusty beneath the stars. Yet there was comfort in this darkness. The Nile villages moved according to rhythms older than memory itself. Flood. Planting. Harvest. Dry season. Rebuilding walls after storms. Grinding grain. Carrying water. Sleeping beneath warm winds. These routines repeated across generations until they became almost part of the earth itself. Night simply marked another quiet pause within that endless cycle. In one small courtyard, a mother remained awake beside her sleeping son. The child had developed a fever earlier that afternoon after working beside irrigation ditches beneath harsh sunlight. Now he slept restlessly beneath a thin cloth while she dipped linen into cool water from a jar and pressed it gently against his forehead. Outside the walls, the village barely moved. An owl called once from somewhere near the palms. Then silence returned again. The mother listened to the faint breathing of her child and the distant sound of river water. She had heard these same nighttime sounds since childhood. Her own mother had listened to them. Her grandmother too. Generations of ordinary Egyptians had fallen asleep beside the Nile while frogs sang in the reeds and warm wind drifted through mud brick homes. Kings rose and disappeared far away in stone palaces and temples. But the villages remained. Workers still woke before dawn. Bread still baked in clay ovens. Fishing boats still crossed dark water before sunrise. Children still chased each other beside dusty roads until mothers called them home at dusk. And every night, slowly and softly, the villages quieted beneath the stars once again. Hours passed gently. The moon climbed higher over the riverbanks. Shadows shifted across sleeping rooftops. Donkeys occasionally stamped their feet against insects. Somewhere a clay jar cracked softly as cooler night air finally touched pottery heated all day beneath the sun. Near the center of the village, a scribe sat awake longer than most. His small room smelled faintly of papyrus reeds, lamp smoke, and ink made from soot and water. Records still lay scattered beside him. Tax numbers. Grain counts. Names of workers. Deliveries from nearby farms. His back ached from bending over low tables since early morning. Now, at last, he allowed himself to rest. The oil lamp beside him flickered weakly. Outside, the village had nearly disappeared into silence. He could hear only distant insects and the quiet movement of night wind passing through narrow streets. Carefully, he rolled the final papyrus scroll and placed it beside the others. Tomorrow would begin again before sunrise. But for now, there was only darkness, warm air, and the slow breathing of the ancient village beside the Nile. The hours just before dawn were often the quietest moments in an Egyptian village. By then, even the last conversations had faded away. Oil lamps burned low inside small homes, their weak flames trembling softly in shallow dishes of clay. The air felt heavier near the ground where heat still clung to walls and sleeping bodies. Overhead, the stars remained bright and endless, though slowly, very slowly, the eastern edge of the sky began to lose a little darkness. Most villagers remained asleep during this hour. The fishermen resting beside the river had wrapped themselves loosely in linen cloths against the cooler breeze drifting over the water. Farmers lay on rooftops with arms folded beneath their heads. Children slept in uneven positions beside parents, brothers, sisters, and grandparents. Some families shared space with baskets of onions, jars of grain, and small animals resting nearby in the same room. Breathing filled the homes softly. A quiet chorus of sleeping sounds moved through the village. Gentle snoring. Someone turning over on a reed mat. A sleepy cough from deep inside a narrow house. The rustling of linen against skin damp from the warm night air. Ancient Egypt did not fully separate people from one another. Villages were close places. Walls were thin. Roads were narrow. Sounds drifted easily between homes. At night, one family could hear another waking with a sick child or speaking quietly after a long day. Privacy belonged mostly to the wealthy. Ordinary workers lived together closely, sharing both hardship and comfort. In one small house near the grain storage area, a potter stirred awake before the others around him. His body had learned this habit after years of labor beginning before sunrise. For several moments he simply lay still, listening. He heard the distant croaking of frogs along the Nile. He heard wind brushing softly against hanging palm fibers outside. And somewhere beyond the fields, he heard the faint cry of a bird greeting the approaching dawn. The potter slowly sat up. His shoulders ached from shaping clay all day beside the heat of firing ovens. Tiny cracks marked his hands and fingertips where dry clay had split the skin. Dust still covered his arms even after washing earlier beside the riverbank. Beside him, his wife and youngest daughter remained asleep. He moved carefully, trying not to wake them. The floor beneath his feet felt cool compared to the daytime heat. He reached for a clay cup filled earlier with water and drank slowly in the darkness. The water tasted faintly of river mud and the porous jar that had cooled it through the night. Outside, the village still slept beneath fading stars. But dawn was beginning its slow approach. In ancient Egypt, the first signs of morning mattered deeply. Work depended on daylight. The cool hours after sunrise were precious, especially during the hottest seasons when midday heat became almost unbearable. Many workers tried to complete their hardest labor before the sun climbed too high. So the villages often began waking long before sunrise itself. At first, the sounds were almost too soft to notice. A doorway creaked open. Someone shook sand from a woven mat. A woman stepped quietly into a courtyard carrying an empty water jar. A donkey snorted somewhere near the road. The village slowly stretched awake. Near the riverbank, two fishermen untied a small wooden boat beneath dim moonlight. Their movements were practiced and quiet. Rope slid against wood with soft scraping sounds. One man adjusted a folded net while the other pushed gently against the muddy shore until the boat drifted into dark water. Neither spoke very much. There was no need. The river itself seemed to encourage silence at this hour. Mist hovered faintly above the Nile in pale drifting layers. Reeds along the shore stood motionless in the calm air. The fishermen dipped their oars slowly into the water, creating gentle ripples that spread quietly across the dark surface. Behind them, the village remained mostly shadow. Ahead of them, dawn waited somewhere beyond the eastern horizon. Back among the houses, another sound slowly joined the waking village. Grinding stones. In countless Egyptian homes, women rose early to grind grain before the day fully began. The work was repetitive and exhausting. Kneeling beside large flat stones, they crushed barley or emmer wheat into coarse flour using heavy hand stones pushed back and forth again and again. The sound became part of daily life in every village. Stone against stone. Slow. Rhythmic. Steady. Even before sunrise, these grinding sounds drifted softly through narrow streets as families prepared bread for the coming day. One elderly woman worked alone in a dim courtyard lit only by a fading oil lamp. Her gray hair was tied loosely behind her neck. Years of grinding grain had bent her back slightly forward. Yet her hands still moved with calm strength and familiarity. Push. Scrape. Push. Scrape. Nearby, dough from the previous evening rested beneath cloth inside a shallow bowl. Soon it would be shaped into rough loaves and baked inside a clay oven already carrying yesterday's heat within its thick walls. The smells of baking often arrived early in Egyptian villages. Warm grain. Ash. Smoke. Yeast. For tired workers preparing for another day beneath the sun, these smells carried comfort before the labor even began. As dawn moved closer, more villagers emerged into the narrow roads. A young servant hurried toward a wealthy household carrying two jars balanced carefully across her shoulders. Her sandals brushed dust softly with each step. She looked tired already. Servants often worked longer hours than many farmers, moving constantly between kitchens, courtyards, storehouses, and sleeping rooms. Not far away, a farmer checked the tether of his donkey before preparing tools for the fields. Wooden handles worn smooth from years of use leaned against a wall beside baskets woven from reeds. He stretched slowly, still stiff from yesterday's work cutting irrigation channels beneath the burning afternoon sun. The village no longer felt silent now. Quiet voices began rising through the morning air. A mother called softly to a sleepy child. A goat bleated impatiently near a doorway. Someone laughed briefly while speaking with a neighbor beside the road. Still, everything remained gentle. Even the busiest mornings in many villages carried a slower rhythm than the crowded temple cities farther north. The eastern sky slowly turned pale blue. Birds moved among palm trees beside the river. Their calls echoed lightly through the cool morning air. Smoke began rising from small cooking fires, thin gray lines drifting upward into the brightening sky. And then, little by little, the stars disappeared. For the workers of ancient Egypt, another long day had begun. But the memory of the quiet night still lingered. Inside homes, people folded sleeping mats and stored blankets before heat filled the rooms again. Rooftops where families had slept beneath the stars became empty except for scattered sandals and woven baskets left behind in the dim light. Children rubbed their eyes and ate pieces of bread while adults prepared tools and supplies. Some boys would spend the day helping in fields or workshops. Some girls would carry water, grind grain, clean floors, or help care for younger children. Life began early. And for most villagers, it was physically demanding from sunrise until darkness returned again. Along the Nile, farmers moved toward fields still damp from nighttime moisture. Bare feet pressed into cool soil. Irrigation channels reflected pale morning light between rows of crops. The fertile black earth near the river smelled rich and wet compared to the dry desert beyond. The sounds of labor slowly replaced the silence of night. Wooden tools struck dirt. Water splashed into channels. Workers called to one another across fields. Donkeys groaned beneath loaded baskets. Yet even during these busy hours, the memory of nighttime calm remained important to villagers. Night offered relief. It allowed overheated bodies to recover. It created moments of stillness after endless movement and labor beneath the sun. Throughout Egypt, ordinary people waited for evening almost every day. Especially during the hotter months. By midday, the villages often changed completely. The cool softness of dawn disappeared beneath harsh sunlight. Mud brick walls reflected heat into narrow roads. Air shimmered above open ground. Workers wrapped linen around their heads while sweat darkened their clothes and skin. The same quiet roads that felt peaceful at night now carried noise and movement. Merchants passed through with donkeys loaded with fish, reeds, baskets, or pottery. Children ran errands between homes. Bakers fed ovens with dried reeds and dung for fuel. Potters shaped wet clay while flies circled lazily through workshops thick with heat. And always, somewhere nearby, the Nile continued flowing beside the villages. Its sound changed slightly during the day. At night, the river seemed calm and secretive, almost hidden beneath darkness. But in daylight, it became alive again. Oars splashed. Birds cried overhead. Boats creaked against docks. Fishermen shouted across the water. Still, even during busy afternoons, villagers often spoke about the coming evening with quiet anticipation. When the sun lowers. When the air cools. When the children stop running. When the ovens fade. When the roads finally grow quiet again. In one workshop near the edge of the village, a carpenter paused from his work and wiped sweat from his forehead with tired hands. Wood was precious in Egypt and often imported from distant lands, so every piece mattered. The carpenter worked carefully shaping a stool for a household nearby. Outside his doorway, heat pressed heavily across the village. The smell of dust and warm mud filled the air. For a moment, the carpenter looked toward the Nile shining brightly beneath the afternoon sun. He knew the evening would eventually arrive. The riverbanks would darken. Palm shadows would stretch across the roads. Families would gather again beside doorways and rooftops. And the sounds would soften once more. Hours passed slowly beneath the heat. Then, at last, the sun began its descent. The light over the village turned golden and low. Workers started returning from fields carrying tools across tired shoulders. Fishermen prepared evening nets. Cooking fires glowed brighter as darkness slowly approached. And once again, ancient Egypt moved gently toward nighttime. Children who had spent the day outdoors now sat sleepily beside parents while meals were prepared. Dust clung to their legs and arms. Some leaned against mud brick walls too tired even to speak. Inside homes, women mixed dough, cut vegetables, and poured beer into cups while smoke drifted upward through openings in roofs. The smell of roasted fish spread through the evening air near the riverbank. Somewhere nearby, lentils simmered slowly inside clay pots. The village exhaled after another long day. As darkness deepened, voices lowered naturally. People spoke more softly at night, in part because exhaustion left little energy for loud conversation. Many workers simply rested in silence after eating. Some sat outside homes staring toward the Nile while warm wind moved through the palms. Others climbed onto rooftops carrying woven mats for sleep. The stars slowly returned overhead. One by one. Familiar and steady. An old fisherman sat beside his grandson near the riverbank while the boy struggled to stay awake. The child listened sleepily as insects hummed in the reeds nearby. Water brushed softly against wooden boats tied along the shore. The old man looked across the dark Nile. He had spent nearly his entire life beside these waters. He knew every sound the river made at night. He knew the creak of old boats, the rustle of reeds before wind arrived, the distant splash of fish near shallow banks. To him, the nighttime sounds of the village were not empty silence. They were signs of life continuing quietly around him. A sleeping child. A mother grinding grain before dawn. A fisherman rowing through darkness. A distant cough behind thin walls. Palm leaves shifting beneath desert wind. The ancient world never fully slept. It simply became softer. And as another warm Egyptian night settled gently over the village beside the Nile, the familiar sounds returned once more, calm and steady beneath the endless stars. The deeper hours of the night carried a different feeling from the evenings. Early evening still held traces of the day. Cooking fires glowed beside homes. Families spoke quietly while finishing meals. Children resisted sleep and wandered sleepily through courtyards before finally settling onto woven mats. The scent of bread, smoke, fish, and warm dust drifted through the narrow roads while the last traces of sunset faded from the sky. But much later, after midnight, the villages changed again. The world became slower. Even the wind seemed softer during those hours. Along the Nile, darkness settled thickly over the water until river and sky almost blended together. Boats tied beside muddy banks rocked gently against one another with small hollow sounds. Reeds whispered faintly whenever the breeze passed through them. Frogs continued their endless songs near the marshes, repeating the same gentle rhythms over and over into the darkness. For many Egyptians, these sounds had filled every night of their lives. A child born beside the Nile would hear them from infancy. An old farmer nearing the end of his years would still fall asleep listening to the same water and reeds he had known since childhood. Generations passed, rulers changed, temples rose and weathered beneath the sun, but the nighttime sounds of the river villages remained almost unchanged. In one quiet lane near the center of the village, a small oil lamp still burned inside the home of a weaver. The flame moved weakly in the warm air. The weaver himself sat cross-legged beside a low loom while the rest of his household slept nearby. Linen threads stretched carefully across the wooden frame. His fingers moved slowly in the dim light, guiding thread through thread with practiced patience. The work was difficult to complete during the hottest part of the day. So sometimes, especially during the warmer seasons, craftsmen continued small tasks deep into the night when the air finally became tolerable. The loom made faint clicking sounds. Wood touching wood. Thread sliding softly through careful hands. Outside the house, silence rested over the road. Only occasionally did footsteps pass by now. Perhaps a villager returning from caring for animals near the fields. Perhaps someone walking to the river for cooler air before trying to sleep again. Most homes were dark. Inside them, tired workers rested heavily after long labor beneath the Egyptian sun. One man dreamed uneasily beside a cracked wall still warm from the day's heat. Earlier that afternoon he had spent hours lifting baskets of wet mud to repair irrigation channels damaged by shifting water. His shoulders burned with soreness. Dried mud still clung beneath his fingernails. Even in sleep, his breathing remained heavy with exhaustion. Beside him, his wife slept lightly with one arm resting across their youngest child. Nearby, a clay jar slowly cooled the room's drinking water through the night air. The village was full of small sounds like these. Quiet human sounds. Soft breathing. Fabric rustling. Someone murmuring in sleep. The gentle creak of old wooden furniture shifting beneath resting bodies. Nothing dramatic disturbed the darkness. Ancient village life rarely carried the excitement later storytellers imagined when speaking of Egypt. Most lives were shaped not by grand events, but by repetition. Labor returned each morning. Heat returned each afternoon. Sleep returned each night. And so the villages learned to move gently through these endless cycles. On the edge of the settlement, beyond the last rows of homes, a few goats rested beside a low stone wall. Occasionally one shifted position with a faint snort before settling again. Beyond them stretched open farmland silvered faintly beneath moonlight. The fields looked peaceful at night. In daylight they demanded endless work. Farmers spent long hours bent over crops beneath burning skies. They carried water, repaired channels, pulled weeds, guided animals, and watched carefully for signs of disease or failed flooding. During harvest seasons, the labor became even more exhausting. Entire families worked from dawn until darkness gathering grain before it spoiled beneath heat or birds. But now, in the deep quiet of night, the fields simply waited. The Nile's annual flooding had shaped Egyptian life for thousands of years. Villages rose where fertile earth met dependable water. Every season followed patterns connected to the river's behavior. Floodwaters arrived. Soil darkened and renewed itself. Crops were planted. Harvest followed. Then the dry heat returned once again. Even at night, villagers remained aware of the river. Some slept lightly during flood season, listening for unusual sounds from irrigation channels or riverbanks. Too much water could destroy homes and fields. Too little threatened hunger later in the year. The Nile was generous, but it also demanded attention. Near the shore, an older fisherman sat awake alone beside a tide boat. Sleep did not always come easily with age. He rested on an overturned basket while looking across the dark water. His face was lined deeply from years beneath sunlight reflected off the Nile. One knee pained him constantly now, especially after damp evenings near the river. Still, he loved these quiet hours. He listened carefully. Water tapped gently against wood. A fish splashed somewhere farther downstream. Palm branches shifted softly overhead. Far away, he heard the faint barking of dogs from another village along the riverbank. The sounds traveled clearly through the cool night air. The fisherman remembered nights from many years earlier when he had sat beside the same river as a young man repairing nets with friends after dark. They had spoken quietly about weather, fish, taxes, marriage, and the endless demands of work. Some of those men were gone now. Some had grown old beside him. Others had disappeared into cities farther north. But the river remained. The nighttime sounds remained too. In wealthier households, servants sometimes moved silently through courtyards long after others slept. One servant girl carried folded linen through a shaded hallway lit only by moonlight entering from above. Her bare feet made almost no sound against the stone floor. The large house around her felt different from the crowded mud brick homes of ordinary workers, yet nighttime softened those differences somewhat. Even wealthy Egyptians eventually surrendered to darkness and sleep. Lamps dimmed. Voices faded. Cool air drifted slowly through open spaces. And somewhere beyond every wall, the Nile continued its patient movement through the land. Temples also changed at night. During the day they filled with incense, chanting, offerings, and movement. Priests washed statues, burned oils, prepared rituals, and maintained sacred spaces with careful routine. But later, after ceremonies ended, many temples became deeply still. Stone held the day's warmth long into the evening. Massive columns disappeared into shadow beneath starlight. Torches flickered weakly near entrances where guards remained awake. From nearby villages, ordinary workers sometimes glimpsed temple silhouettes against the night sky while returning home after dark. The great structures must have seemed ancient even to them, rising above the quieter world of farms and fishing boats. Yet most villagers spent little time thinking about monumental buildings during the night. They thought instead about tomorrow's labor. Would the heat be worse tomorrow? Would the river remain stable? Would grain stores last until harvest? Would aching muscles recover enough for another day in the fields? Ordinary life shaped the rhythm of thought more than grand history ever did. Inside one cramped home, a mother suddenly woke to the sound of coughing. Her youngest son sat upright struggling for breath after breathing dust all day while helping repair roads near the riverbank. Dust filled Egyptian life constantly. It covered skin, clothing, food, tools, floors, and lungs. Workers breathed it during harvests, construction, quarrying, and long walks across dry roads. The mother handed the child cool water from a nearby jar. Outside, the village remained quiet. No one else stirred. Eventually the boy's breathing slowed, and he lay back down beside his brothers beneath the warm darkness. The mother stayed awake longer. She listened to the night sounds drifting through the walls. Somewhere nearby, reeds brushed together softly in the wind. A donkey shifted against its tether rope. Insects hummed endlessly beneath the stars. These sounds could feel comforting during lonely hours before dawn. No matter how tired or poor a villager might be, the familiar nighttime rhythms remained steady around them. The ancient world often smelled different at night as well. Daytime heat intensified the odors of animals, sweat, mud, fish, crowded roads, and workshops. But cooler air after sunset softened many of those smells. Instead, nighttime carried scents of river water, cooling earth, smoke from fading fires, fresh bread stored for morning meals, and damp reeds near the Nile. Sometimes desert wind brought dry mineral smells from beyond the fertile land. At other times, the river breeze carried moisture deep into the villages. The people sleeping there rarely thought consciously about these details. They simply lived among them every day and night. Yet together these small sensations formed the atmosphere of ordinary Egyptian life far more than palaces or monuments ever could. Hours passed quietly. The moon drifted westward over the village rooftops. One by one, oil lamps went dark as their fuel finally disappeared. Darkness deepened inside the homes. Then slowly, almost unnoticed at first, the world began preparing once more for dawn. Birds shifted in palm trees. The breeze cooled slightly. The eastern horizon lost a little darkness. A woman sleeping lightly on a rooftop opened her eyes and looked upward at the fading stars. Around her, other family members still slept beneath thin linen coverings. She could already feel tomorrow waiting nearby. Soon the grinding stones would begin again. Soon workers would return to fields and workshops. Soon smoke would rise into the morning air. But for another few moments, the village remained suspended in quiet stillness. This hour belonged neither fully to night nor morning. The Nile reflected faint silver beneath the sky. Fishing boats rested silently near shore. Mud brick walls stood pale beneath moonlight. And across the sleeping village, ordinary Egyptians breathed slowly in the final peaceful moments before another long day beside the river began. Before the first light fully touched the Nile, the villages already began to stir beneath the fading darkness. The change happened slowly. No loud signal announced the morning. No bells rang across the riverbanks. Instead, life returned through small familiar sounds spreading gently from house to house, rooftop to rooftop, courtyard to courtyard. A sleeping donkey shook its head beside a mud brick wall, the rope at its neck scraping softly against wood. A woman quietly unfolded a reed mat after waking before the rest of her family. Somewhere near the riverbank, the first oar entered the water with a slow, careful splash. The night did not end all at once. It slowly loosened its hold over the village. In one small rooftop sleeping area, a family still rested beneath the pale stars. The father lay awake already, staring upward while warm wind drifted across the flat roof. His body was sore from carrying heavy baskets of grain the previous day. The muscles in his back tightened each morning before movement slowly loosened them again. Beside him, his youngest daughter slept with one arm stretched across her face to block the faint growing light. He listened quietly. From nearby rooftops came the soft sounds of others waking too. Linen cloth rustling. Quiet footsteps. Someone clearing their throat after sleep. The low murmur of neighbors greeting one another before the day's work began again. Below, in the narrow road beside the house, a stray dog wandered through drifting dust searching for scraps left from the evening meal. The village still belonged partly to the night. Moonlight remained trapped in the shadows between buildings while the eastern horizon slowly brightened beyond the Nile. For workers in ancient Egypt, these early moments mattered deeply. The coolest hours of the day disappeared quickly once the sun climbed higher. Farmers especially valued the gentle air before sunrise. Many tried to complete difficult labor before heat spread across the fields. Already, figures moved toward the farmland beyond the village. Some carried hoes across their shoulders. Others balanced baskets or tools in silence while walking narrow dirt paths between irrigation channels. Their sandals brushed softly against the dry earth. The fields smelled different at dawn. The soil still held traces of nighttime moisture. Damp earth mixed with the scent of reeds and river water drifting inland from the Nile. For a short time each morning, the land felt calm and almost cool. But everyone knew the heat would return. Near a low clay oven at the center of the village, an elderly baker crouched beside fading coals from the previous night. He fed dried reeds into the fire carefully while smoke curled upward into the pale dawn air. Soon the village would smell of bread again. The baker worked slowly but steadily. His hands moved from memory after decades repeating the same routine every morning before sunrise. Mix the dough. Shape the loaves. Feed the fire. Wait for heat. Turn the bread carefully before the bottoms burned. Around him, the village gradually brightened. Roosters called from hidden courtyards. Birds fluttered through palm trees near the riverbank. Voices grew slightly louder as more people stepped outside into the dawn. A pair of young boys hurried sleepily along the road carrying empty water jars between them. They still looked half asleep, their hair uneven from the night. One rubbed his eyes while walking. Their mother had sent them early before the riverbank became crowded with other villagers collecting water. The Nile itself seemed softer at dawn than during the busy hours later in the day. Mist hovered low above the water. Fishing boats moved quietly through pale light. The river reflected streaks of gray, silver, and faint gold as morning slowly spread across the sky. Along the shore, women knelt beside the water filling jars while speaking quietly together. their voices blended with the sound of moving water and distant birds. One woman laughed softly at something another whispered. Then silence returned again. Even conversation remained calm at this hour. The tiredness of early morning still lingered in everyone's movements. Ancient Egyptian villages often smelled strongest during these dawn hours. Fresh bread baking. Smoke from cooking fires. Damp river mud. Animals waking in crowded courtyards. Crushed herbs. Wet reeds stacked beside boats. All of it mixed together beneath the slowly brightening sky. Inside one crowded home, a young mother prepared a simple morning meal while her children slowly woke nearby. She tore pieces of coarse bread into bowls and poured watered beer beside them. The youngest child still leaned sleepily against the wall, barely awake enough to eat. The mother herself looked exhausted. The previous day had been long. She had carried water repeatedly from the Nile, cleaned grain, repaired clothing, swept dust from floors, cared for the children, and helped prepare food long after darkness arrived. Sleep rarely lasted enough for women responsible for households in the villages. Still, the morning routine began again without pause. Outside, sandals tapped lightly along the road as neighbors headed toward work. A carpenter carried wood carefully wrapped in cloth to protect it from damage. Wood remained valuable throughout Egypt and was never wasted carelessly. Nearby, a fisherman spread part of his net across the ground, inspecting it in the growing light for tiers needing repair. The sounds of labor slowly returned to the village. Not harsh sounds. Steady sounds. Rhythms repeated every day across countless settlements along the Nile. Stone grinding grain. Water pouring into jars. Tools knocking gently together. Donkeys breathing heavily beneath loaded baskets. The ancient world waking itself. As sunrise approached fully, the stars vanished one by one overhead. The sky brightened into pale gold behind distant palms. Shadows shortened slowly across rooftops and narrow roads. Then the first sunlight finally touched the upper walls of the village. Warmth returned immediately. Workers walking toward the fields could already feel the heat beginning again on their skin. The cool comfort of night faded quickly in Egypt. Soon the roads would shimmer beneath harsh daylight. But for now, dawn still carried softness. Near the edge of the village, a group of farmers paused briefly beside an irrigation canal before beginning work. Water moved quietly between mud banks toward the fields. One farmer bent down and splashed cool water onto his face while another stretched sore shoulders beneath the rising sun. Their conversation remained low and unhurried. They spoke about the river level. About a neighbor recovering from illness. About whether insects had damaged part of the barley crop farther south. Ordinary conversations. The kinds of quiet exchanges repeated every morning across generations. Nearby, ibis birds stepped carefully through shallow water searching for food while insects drifted above the canal reeds. Then work began. Farmers moved into the fields carrying tools worn smooth by years of use. Their feet sank slightly into damp soil. Soon sweat would cover their bodies again. Soon dust would cling to their skin beneath the growing heat. But the early hours remained gentle for a little longer. Back in the village, workshops slowly opened one by one. The potter prepared wet clay beside his wheel while sunlight crept into the doorway. The blacksmith arranged tools near glowing coals already warming the small workshop. A linen weaver stretched thread carefully across a loom while dust floated through beams of morning light. Each trade carried its own sounds. The scrape of clay. The tapping of wood. The soft pull of thread. The hiss of heated metal. Together these sounds formed the daytime music of the villages. Yet many workers still preferred the quiet of night. Daytime demanded too much from the body. The heat could become crushing by midday, especially during the long dry seasons when little wind moved through the land. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads. Some paused beneath shade whenever possible. Others continued labor beneath direct sunlight simply because they had no choice. The villages themselves changed beneath the heat. Roads emptied during the harshest hours. Animals rested in shadows. Children grew quieter from exhaustion. Even conversation slowed. In one shaded courtyard, an elderly grandmother sat grinding herbs while watching younger children play nearby. The smallest child dragged a broken basket through the dust pretending it was a boat crossing the Nile. The old woman smiled faintly but said little. She listened instead. From beyond the walls came the sounds of distant labor carrying through the afternoon air. Someone hammering wood. Someone shouting to guide a donkey cart through a narrow lane. Somewhere farther away, fishermen unloading baskets near the riverbank. Life continued endlessly around her. The old woman had heard these sounds nearly every day since childhood. At night they would fade again. The roads would cool. The stars would return. Families would climb onto rooftops seeking air beneath the darkness. And the village would once more soften into quiet breathing beside the Nile. As afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, shadows lengthened across the dusty roads. Workers began returning from the fields with slower, heavier steps. Their clothing clung to sweat. Dust coated their arms and faces. The village seemed tired. A tiredness shared by nearly everyone. Yet evening always brought relief. Children perked up again once sunlight weakened. Cooking fires were lit. Water jars were refilled. Men washed beside the river while talking quietly about the day's labor. The smell of bread returned once more. Smoke drifted upward through the warm evening air. And somewhere nearby, a fisherman untied his small boat, preparing to move onto the darkening Nile beneath the first returning stars. The Nile looked almost black beneath the evening sky. Only small pieces of fading sunlight still shimmered across the slow-moving water as the fisherman guided his boat away from the muddy shore. The wooden hull creaked softly beneath him. Behind the village, the last warmth of the day still clung to the mud brick walls and narrow roads, but already the air felt easier to breathe. Night was returning once again. Along the riverbank, villagers moved through familiar evening routines with the calm slowness that arrived after exhausting labor. Farmers washed dust from their arms and faces beside the water. Children chased each other lazily through the fading light, too tired for real running now. Women carried fresh jars of water back toward their homes while smoke from cooking fires drifted low across the village. The sounds of daytime had begun to soften. Farther out on the Nile, the fisherman paused his rowing for a moment and listened. The evening carried many layers of sound. Birds settling into the reeds. Water brushing gently against papyrus stems. Voices floating faintly from the village behind him. The crackle of cooking fires. A donkey groaning somewhere near the storage buildings. None of it felt loud. The sounds blended together softly beneath the growing darkness. Above the western desert, the sky slowly turned deep orange and faded into purple. Palm trees stood dark against the horizon. Beyond them stretched endless dry land where the heat of the day still rose invisibly from stone and sand. But near the river, cooler air slowly gathered. For many villagers, this was the most peaceful hour of the entire day. The hardest work was finished. Night meals were being prepared. The pressure of the sun had finally loosened its grip over the land. Bodies still ached, but at least they no longer baked beneath direct heat. Near the center of the village, several families sat outside their homes while waiting for food to finish cooking. They did not always speak much. After long labor, silence itself could feel comforting. One elderly farmer leaned against a wall with tired eyes half closed while his grandson rested beside him chewing slowly on a piece of bread. The old man listened to familiar evening sounds drifting through the road. Sandals scraping dust. Clay bowls touching together. Quiet laughter from neighbors farther down the lane. The old man had spent nearly his whole life in villages like this one. Every season carried different work, different worries, different hardships. Floods could fail. Crops could weaken. Illness could spread through crowded homes during the hottest months. Yet evenings beside the Nile often remained calm despite everything. Especially once darkness fully arrived. Inside a nearby house, a woman knelt beside a small clay oven removing flat round loaves one by one with careful hands. The heat from the oven still pressed heavily into the room, making sweat shine across her forehead even after sunset. Her daughter sat nearby crushing garlic with herbs inside a shallow stone bowl. The smell spread warmly through the air. Bread. Garlic. Smoke. Warm grain. These evening smells drifted through nearly every Egyptian village night after night for centuries. Outside the doorway, a small boy sat fighting sleep while waiting for the meal. His head nodded forward repeatedly before lifting again. Dust covered his feet from playing along the roads earlier in the evening. Nearby, someone began singing quietly. Not a performance. Only a soft tired melody carried absent-mindedly through the darkness while work continued. The voice rose and faded gently beside the sounds of insects and crackling firewood. Night deepened slowly across the village. The final traces of sunlight disappeared from the riverbanks. Stars emerged overhead one by one until the sky seemed crowded with them. Without bright city lights, the heavens looked endless above ancient Egypt. Many villagers slept beneath those stars whenever the weather allowed it. Rooftops gradually filled with woven mats, blankets, jars of water, and sleeping families preparing for another warm night above the trapped heat inside their homes. Children were often carried upward already asleep in their parents' arms. A young mother climbed carefully onto her rooftop carrying her smallest child against her shoulder. The little boy barely stirred as she laid him gently onto a reed mat beside his brothers and sisters. Around her, neighboring rooftops held similar scenes. Families settling down. Soft conversation fading. Quiet movement slowing little by little. The village becoming still. Yet complete silence never truly arrived. From the river came the occasional splash of fish near the reeds. Somewhere a boat rope knocked rhythmically against wood. Insects hummed steadily through the warm darkness. A baby cried briefly from inside a nearby home before being soothed back into sleep. The night lived and breathed around the village. Near the fields beyond the last houses, several workers remained awake guarding stored grain from animals and thieves. Their small lantern glowed faintly in the distance. One man sat with a spear resting beside him while the other chewed slowly on leftover bread from the evening meal. The fields at night looked peaceful beneath the moonlight. Rows of crops swayed gently in the warm breeze. Irrigation channels reflected pale strips of starlight between dark banks of earth. The hard labor hidden within those fields disappeared temporarily beneath the soft darkness. But the workers guarding them knew better. Tomorrow the labor would begin again before dawn. It always did. Back near the village center, an elderly woman remained awake grinding grain long after most neighbors had settled into sleep. Her household needed extra bread prepared for relatives arriving the next day from another settlement farther north. The grinding stone moved steadily beneath her tired hands. Push. Scrape. Push. Scrape. The sound carried softly into the quiet road outside. Her shoulders ached. Her wrists felt stiff from decades of repetitive labor. Still she continued patiently beneath the weak light of a single oil lamp. Ancient Egypt depended heavily upon invisible labor like hers. The quiet repetitive work that rarely appeared in temple carvings or royal monuments. Grinding grain. Mending nets. Repairing sandals. Carrying water. Washing linen. Preparing food. Cleaning dust from every surface again and again. At night, many of these small tasks continued long after fields and workshops emptied. Inside another nearby home, a young scribe rested beside an open window trying to cool himself before sleep. His work had kept him indoors most of the day recording grain deliveries and labor counts for local officials. The work spared him some physical hardship compared to farmers or builders, but it carried its own exhaustion. His eyes burned from staring at papyrus for hours in dim light. Ink stained his fingertips dark black. His neck ached from bending over low tables. Now he simply listened to the nighttime village. He heard distant frogs along the Nile. A dog barking far away. Someone coughing repeatedly in a nearby house. Then slowly, as the hours passed, even those sounds became fewer. The deeper night arrived gently. The air cooled a little more. Palm leaves whispered softly overhead. The roads emptied almost completely. Along the Nile, the fisherman who had left earlier now drifted quietly through darkness beneath the stars. His net rested beside him in loose coils. The river smelled damp and earthy in the night air. He moved carefully, knowing these waters from memory alone. In the distance, tiny points of light marked villages scattered along the riverbanks. Most were already asleep now beneath flat rooftops and warm winds. The fisherman dipped his hand briefly into the Nile. Cool water slid between his fingers. He listened again. The nighttime river carried different sounds than the daytime river. During daylight, the Nile bustled constantly with movement and labor. But now only occasional noises interrupted the stillness. A distant paddle. Water shifting beneath reeds. Fish jumping briefly before disappearing again into darkness. The fishermen preferred these quiet hours. Out here, far from crowded roads and endless labor, the world felt slower. Above him, stars reflected faintly across the black water. He thought about returning home before dawn. His wife would already be preparing grain by then. Children would still sleep curled together beneath linen cloths on the rooftop. Soon the village would wake once more into heat, dust, labor, and noise. But not yet. For now, ancient Egypt rested. Across the village, tired bodies slept heavily after another long day beneath the sun. Farmers dreamed beside cracked walls still holding traces of heat. Children sprawled unevenly across woven mats. Servants rested sore feet after hours of carrying water and supplies through wealthy households. Even the animals seemed quieter now. Donkeys slept standing near walls. Dogs curled beside doorways. Goats rested silently in dark corners of courtyards. The entire village seemed wrapped in warm darkness and soft breathing. Only the Nile remained fully awake, moving endlessly through the sleeping land beneath the stars. The Nile continued flowing through the darkness as though time itself moved with the river. Long before the first villages were built beside its banks, the water had already traveled north through the fertile land. Long after countless workers, fishermen, scribes, and farmers disappeared into memory, the river would continue moving beneath the same stars. But for the people sleeping beside it tonight, the Nile was not an idea from history. It was simply part of life. Its sounds entered their dreams. Its water cooled their skin after exhausting days. Its flooding shaped their harvests, their hunger, their work, and their rest. And at night, When the world became quiet, the river's presence felt even stronger. Near the edge of the village, a young boy suddenly woke from sleep on the rooftop where his family rested together beneath the open sky. For several moments he did not move. He simply stared upward at the stars scattered endlessly above him. The air felt softer now than earlier in the evening. A gentle breeze moved across the flat rooftops carrying the smell of river water and distant reeds. Nearby, his father snored quietly beneath a folded linen cloth while his younger sister slept with one hand curled beneath her cheek. The boy listened carefully. From somewhere below came the faint sound of footsteps passing along the road. Slow footsteps. Tired footsteps. Perhaps a fisherman returning late from the Nile. Perhaps someone checking animals before dawn approached. Then the sound faded again. The village returned to stillness. The boy had known these nighttime sounds all his life. To him they were ordinary and comforting. He could recognize neighbors by the rhythm of their sandals against the road below. He knew the difference between wind moving through palm leaves and wind moving through reeds beside the water. He even knew which dogs barked at passing strangers and which remained silent through the night. Ancient villages created deep familiarity among the people living there. Everyone heard everyone else. The walls between homes were thin. Roads were narrow. Daily routines repeated endlessly. Even in darkness, villagers recognized the sounds of each other's lives. The boy slowly closed his eyes again. Around him, the rooftop remained warm beneath the stored heat of the day. Mud brick walls released warmth slowly through the night air. During the hottest seasons, some rooftops stayed uncomfortable long after midnight, yet still cooler than the crowded rooms below. Many Egyptians preferred sleeping outdoors whenever possible. Inside the houses, air often became trapped and heavy. Smoke from cooking fires lingered in ceilings and corners. Bodies sleeping close together made the rooms warmer still. On the rooftops at least, the breeze could move freely beneath the stars. In another part of the village, a woman sat awake alone beside a sleeping infant. The child had finally stopped crying after hours of restlessness caused by fever and heat. Now the little body slept quietly against folded cloth while the mother leaned back against the wall with tired eyes. Outside, insects hummed steadily through the darkness. The woman listened absently to the sounds drifting through the night. Somewhere a donkey shifted against stone. A loose wooden shutter knocked softly in the wind. Farther away, faint voices floated briefly from the riverbank before disappearing again. Her body ached with exhaustion. Life in the villages rarely allowed complete rest for mothers caring for children. Even after the day's labor ended, more work waited inside the homes. Grinding grain. Preparing food. Cleaning. Washing. Sewing. Caring for the sick. Night simply changed the rhythm of labor. It did not always end it. Still, there were peaceful moments hidden inside the exhaustion. Moments like this one. Warm air moving gently through the doorway. The soft breathing of a sleeping child. The distant sound of the Nile beneath the stars. Beyond the last homes of the village, the desert waited silently. At night, the empty land beyond the fertile riverbanks felt enormous. Moonlight touched dry stone and sand stretching endlessly into darkness. Occasionally travelers crossing the desert route spotted the faint glow of village fires from far away, tiny islands of life beside the Nile. To the villagers themselves, the desert often represented distance and hardship. The river gave life. The desert reminded them how fragile that life could be. Yet nighttime softened even the harsh edges of the land. Beneath moonlight, the desert hills appeared calm and almost dreamlike beyond the sleeping fields. Near one irrigation canal, a farmer remained awake checking the water flow by lantern light. During certain seasons, maintaining proper irrigation required careful attention even through the night. Too much water could damage crops. Too little could weaken them beneath the sun. The farmer walked slowly beside the canal bank. Mud pressed softly beneath his sandals. The lantern flame flickered each time wind touched it. He looked tired enough to fall asleep standing. Earlier that day he had already spent long hours working beneath severe heat. Sweat had soaked his clothing. Dust had covered his face and arms. Now, instead of resting beside his family, he continued moving through darkness checking gates and channels by weak lamplight. This too was part of ordinary Egyptian life. The endless continuation of work. Yet even here, beside the quiet canal under the stars, there was a strange calmness to the night. The farmer paused for a moment. Water moved steadily through the channel beside him. Frogs croaked from nearby reeds. Far away, he could hear the faint bark of dogs from another settlement along the river. Then silence returned again. The hours before dawn often carried the deepest stillness of all. By then, most fires had gone dark. Most conversations had ended. Even the insects seemed softer as cooler air drifted slowly over the land. Inside a crowded house near the center of the village, an elderly grandfather slept lightly on a woven mat beside two grandchildren. Age had changed his sleep over the years. He woke often now during the night, listening to the sounds outside before drifting slowly back into dreams. Tonight he listened to the wind. Palm branches brushed together overhead with dry whispering sounds. Somewhere nearby, linen cloth fluttered gently where it hung outside a doorway. The old man remembered hearing these same sounds as a child many decades earlier. So much had changed in his lifetime. Children had grown into adults. Neighbors had died. Floods had come and gone. New officials had arrived from larger cities farther north. Yet nighttime itself remained familiar. Darkness beside the Nile still sounded the same. Water. Wind. Reeds. Soft breathing. Distant footsteps. The ancient rhythm of village life continuing beneath the stars. Farther down the road, two brothers slept on a rooftop after spending the entire day hauling stone for repairs at a nearby temple wall. Their muscles still twitched occasionally from exhaustion even in sleep. Fine dust coated their hair and skin despite washing beside the river earlier that evening. The younger brother dreamed uneasily. In the dream he continued carrying heavy baskets beneath burning sunlight that never faded. Endless roads. Endless heat. Endless labor. Then slowly the dream softened. Cool wind drifted across his face. Somewhere nearby, water moved quietly through darkness. The rooftop beneath him felt warm and solid beneath the stars. His breathing slowed again. Around the village, the deepest night continued passing gently. One by one, clouds drifted across the moon before clearing again. Shadows shifted across rooftops and courtyards. A few late fishermen guided boats silently along the Nile while most villagers remained asleep. Ancient Egypt during these quiet hours did not feel like the world of monuments and kings carved into stone. It felt human. Tired workers sleeping beside one another after difficult days. Families breathing softly beneath open skies. Mothers staying awake with sick children. Fishermen listening to water in darkness. Farmers rising before dawn to tend irrigation channels. The nighttime villages belonged to ordinary people more than anyone else. And the sounds reflected that truth. No grand speeches. No marching armies. Only simple life continuing quietly beside the river. As the night slowly moved toward morning once again, the eastern horizon began changing almost too gradually to notice. The blackness softened slightly into deep blue. Stars near the horizon faded first. Birds shifted among the palms. A coolness touched the air that would disappear soon after sunrise. The village still slept mostly unaware. But dawn was approaching again. Soon grinding stones would begin their steady rhythm. Soon smoke would rise from ovens. Soon sandals would scrape against dusty roads as workers returned to fields and workshops beneath the growing heat. But for a little while longer, the village remained suspended between darkness and morning. The Nile reflected faint silver beneath the fading stars. Palm trees stood motionless along the banks. And across the rooftops and narrow roads of the sleeping village, ancient Egypt rested quietly in the final peaceful moments before another day began. The first birds began calling before the sun appeared. Their soft cries drifted through the palm trees beside the Nile while the village still rested beneath fading stars. The sounds were gentle at first, almost hidden within the quiet breathing of sleeping families and the distant murmur of water moving through irrigation channels. Then another bird answered. And another. Slowly, the world prepared itself for morning. On a rooftop near the center of the village, a young farmer opened his eyes and stared upward into the dim blue sky above him. The stars were disappearing now one by one. A thin breeze moved across the rooftop carrying the cool scent of river water and damp earth. For a few moments he remained still. This was often the calmest part of the entire day. Before the heat arrived. Before tools struck the ground. Before dust rose into the roads. Before voices filled the village again. Beside him, his wife and children still slept wrapped loosely in linen cloths. Their breathing rose softly into the quiet dawn air. Somewhere nearby, another rooftop family was beginning to wake as well. He heard someone folding blankets. Someone whispering sleepily. Someone climbing carefully down a ladder toward the courtyard below. The village stretched awake little by little. The farmer sat up slowly, feeling stiffness in his shoulders from the previous day's labor. Yesterday he had spent hours clearing weeds from irrigation ditches beneath harsh sunlight. His hands still felt rough from gripping wooden tools. Tiny cuts crossed his fingers where dry reeds had scraped against the skin. He rubbed his eyes and listened. The Nile. Birds. A distant donkey shifting beside a wall. And then, from somewhere nearby, the familiar sound of grinding stone beginning once more. Push. Scrape. Push. Scrape. Morning grain work had started. In homes across Egypt, women rose before sunrise almost every day to begin preparing bread. The sound of grinding stones belonged to the earliest hours of village life. Even children grew accustomed to waking beside that steady rhythm. Inside a nearby courtyard, an older woman knelt beside a large flat stone while dim morning light slowly entered the space around her. Her movements were practiced and calm despite the strain in her arms and back. The work demanded patience. Hour after hour. Day after day. Year after year. She pushed the heavy grinding stone forward again. Scrape. Then back. Scrape. Nearby, a clay bowl slowly filled with coarse flour. The smell of dusted grain mixed with cool dawn air drifting through the courtyard. Above her, strips of pale sky appeared between rooftop edges while birds moved restlessly among the palms beyond the village. Soon the ovens would be lit. Soon smoke would rise. Soon children would wake hungry beside folded sleeping mats. Ancient Egyptian mornings always began quietly before growing busy. Along the riverbank, fishermen prepared their boats in near silence while mist hovered low above the water. The Nile looked pale silver beneath the fading stars. Oars rested across narrow wooden boats while nets lay coiled carefully nearby. One fisherman bent to untangle part of a net damaged during the previous evening's work. His fingers moved quickly despite the dim light. He wanted to push away from shore before sunrise fully arrived. The coolest fishing hours disappeared quickly once daylight spread across the river. Beside him, another man tightened rope around a wooden post securing extra baskets for the morning catch. Neither spoke much. They had worked together for years and needed few words during these familiar routines. The sounds around them remained soft. Water touching wood. Reeds brushing in the breeze. Bare feet pressing into wet river mud. Farther along the shore, women arrived carrying empty jars balanced carefully against their hips and shoulders. Some spoke quietly together while waiting their turn near the water's edge. Others remained silent with sleepy faces still heavy from the night. One young girl yawned repeatedly while helping her mother fill jars from the Nile. She dipped a smaller clay container into the water and watched ripples spread outward through the pale morning light. The river smelled fresh at dawn. Cool mud. Wet reeds. Flowing water. For a short time each morning, before the day's heat disturbed the air, the Nile carried a peaceful stillness over everything nearby. Back inside the village, smoke began rising from the first cooking fires. Thin gray lines drifted upward between mud brick walls while the smell of warming bread slowly spread through the roads. The village no longer felt asleep now. More doorways opened. More footsteps appeared along the paths. Children rubbed their eyes while carrying baskets outside. Men stretched tired backs before heading toward the fields. Servants hurried through courtyards inside wealthier homes already beginning their long day of work. Morning light slowly revealed the full shape of the village again. Dusty roads. Flat rooftops. Clay ovens. Palm shadows stretching long across the ground. Donkeys tied beside storage rooms. Piles of reeds stacked near workshops. Everything that night had softened into shadow now returned clearly beneath the growing dawn. Near the edge of the settlement, a potter stepped outside his workshop and examined several finished jars left cooling overnight. He touched the clay carefully, checking for cracks caused by uneven firing. The jars stood quietly in rows beneath the pale morning sky. Some would carry grain. Some water. Some beer. Some oil. Ordinary objects for ordinary lives. The potter himself looked exhausted already despite the day barely beginning. His eyes carried dark circles from years of long labor beside hot kilns and dusty clay. Still, he smiled faintly when he saw the jars had cooled properly through the night. Nearby, two small children chased each other through the road before their mother called sharply for them to help carry fuel to the oven. Their laughter echoed briefly through the village before fading again into the growing morning activity. Daytime sounds had returned. Not suddenly. Gradually. The village awakening in layers. A carpenter opened his workshop shutters with a wooden creak. A goat bleated impatiently from a shaded courtyard. Someone coughed heavily after sleeping in smoky air. Clay cups knocked softly together during breakfast preparations. Every sound blended into the familiar rhythm of another Egyptian morning. And above all of it, the sun finally appeared. Golden light spilled slowly across the Nile first, turning the water bright beneath the remaining mist. Then the sunlight climbed the riverbanks and reached the village walls one by one. Warmth followed immediately. Workers in the fields could already feel heat building against their skin though the day had barely begun. They moved faster now while the air remained tolerable. Rows of crops stretched green and dark beside irrigation channels glimmering in the sun. Farmers bent over the earth with tools in hand while birds circled overhead searching for insects disturbed by movement in the soil. The smell of damp earth slowly gave way to dry dust as the morning warmed. One young farmer paused briefly beside an irrigation ditch and wiped sweat from his forehead. He looked toward the village where smoke still rose gently into the brightening sky. By nightfall he would be exhausted again. His body already knew it. Yet this rhythm shaped nearly every life beside the Nile. Morning labor. Midday heat. Evening relief. Nighttime rest. Then morning again. In one crowded home, a mother finished dividing bread among her children before beginning her own long list of tasks. There would be water to carry, grain to clean, floors to sweep, clothing to mend, vegetables to prepare. The work inside homes rarely ended. Even during the quietest nighttime hours, women often continued repairing tools or preparing food by weak oil lamps while others slept nearby. Yet dawn always arrived too soon. Outside her doorway, the village roads grew busier now. Workers moved steadily toward fields and workshops while merchants arranged baskets of goods near the market area. Donkeys loaded with reeds and supplies shuffled slowly through the dust. The cool softness of night had fully disappeared. The daytime world of ancient Egypt had returned again. Still, traces of the night remained hidden everywhere. On rooftops where sleeping mats still lay folded. In the fading coolness trapped briefly inside shaded rooms. In the tired eyes of workers who had not rested enough. And in the memory of those peaceful hours when the village rested quietly beneath stars beside the Nile. As the sun climbed higher into the brightening sky, the sounds of labor spread farther across the land once more. Stones striking earth. Water pouring into channels. Voices calling through fields. The endless movement of ordinary life continuing beside the river exactly as it had for generations. By mid-morning, the softness of dawn had almost completely vanished. The sun climbed steadily higher above the Nile, and warmth spread across the village roads, fields, rooftops, and courtyards. Shadows that had stretched long and cool across the earth earlier now shrank beneath the growing brightness. Dust lifted easily beneath passing feet and drifted lazily through the air. The village had fully awakened. From every direction came the steady sounds of labor. Grinding stones scraped inside courtyards. Wood knocked against wood in workshops. Donkeys groaned beneath heavy loads. Farmers called quietly to one another across the fields. And always, somewhere nearby, the river continued its endless movement beside the land. Near the edge of the village, a group of women stood beside a shallow washing area near the Nile beating linen cloth against smooth stones. Water splashed rhythmically around them while wet fabric snapped sharply in the warm air. Their work was tiring even in the morning. The sun reflected brightly from the river surface, making the heat feel stronger near the water. Sweat already darkened the edges of their linen clothing while insects drifted around damp reeds nearby. Still, they continued patiently. Wash. Rinse. Lift. Fold. Ancient Egyptian life depended on endless repetition. The same tasks returned every day. Bread had to be baked again. Water carried again. Floors swept again. Clothing repaired again. Fields watered again. At night these routines faded into silence for a few precious hours, but morning always brought them back. In a narrow shaded workshop nearby, a sandal maker sat cross-legged shaping leather strips with careful fingers. Sandals wore down quickly beneath hot dust, rough stone, and endless walking. Farmers, servants, fishermen, merchants, children, nearly everyone depended upon them. The workshop smelled strongly of leather, oil, and dust warmed by sunlight. Outside the doorway, the road shimmered faintly beneath the heat. A little farther down the lane, children gathered around an old storyteller resting in the shade beside a wall. He was too old now for heavy labor in the fields, but his voice remained steady and calm. The children sat quietly while he spoke about river floods from many years earlier when the Nile had risen so high that boats drifted near homes usually far from the shore. His words moved slowly, gently. The children listened sleepily beneath the growing heat. Even stories in the villages often carried the slow rhythm of the land itself. Nearby, a goat wandered lazily through the dust searching for scraps while flies circled around its ears. The animal paused near a doorway where fresh bread cooled on woven trays beneath cloth coverings. The smell drifted into the road. Warm grain. Ash. Smoke. By this hour, nearly every household had finished the first meal of the day. Workers now focused fully on labor before the worst heat arrived around midday. In the fields beyond the village, farmers moved steadily through rows of crops while irrigation water glimmered beside them. The earth near the Nile remained dark and fertile compared to the pale desert stretching beyond the cultivated land. One farmer bent low to clear weeds from around young barley shoots. Sweat dripped steadily from his forehead into the soil below. Nearby, another worker repaired part of a damaged canal wall where water had begun leaking into dry ground. The work never truly paused. Even during flood seasons, different labor replaced old labor. Channels had to be redirected. Storage rooms repaired. Boats secured. Grain measured and protected. The river gave life, but it demanded constant attention. Birds moved slowly through the fields searching for insects disturbed by human movement. Their calls echoed softly beneath the brightening sky. Occasionally farmers waved them away from crops with tired gestures before returning to work again. By late morning, the heat pressed harder against the land. Inside the village, many roads grew quieter as people searched for shade whenever possible. Mud brick walls absorbed sunlight and released warmth back into the narrow lanes. Air shimmered above flat rooftops. The calm coolness of night felt very far away now. Inside one crowded home, an elderly grandmother sat near the doorway trying to catch a faint breeze while mending torn linen clothing. Her fingers moved carefully despite stiff joints swollen from age and years of repetitive work. Nearby, two younger children rested half asleep on the floor beside baskets of onions and garlic waiting to be prepared for the evening meal. Even children often became quiet during the hottest part of the day. The grandmother listened to the sounds outside. Distant hammering from a workshop. Someone shouting softly at a stubborn donkey. Footsteps passing slowly through the heat. These daytime sounds felt heavier than the nighttime village sounds. Everything moved with more effort beneath the sun. In wealthier households, servants crossed shaded courtyards carrying water jars and trays of food while trying to avoid direct sunlight whenever possible. The larger homes offered slightly more protection from heat, but labor inside them remained constant. A young servant girl hurried along a covered hallway balancing folded linen against her shoulder. Sweat dampened loose strands of hair around her face. Earlier that morning she had already carried water from the Nile several times, swept sleeping rooms, and helped prepare bread in the kitchen courtyard. Her feet ached. Still the day stretched ahead of her. Ancient Egyptian villages rested upon countless ordinary workers like her whose names history never remembered. People who cooked, cleaned, carried, lifted, built, washed, planted, repaired. At night, they slept beneath the same stars as everyone else, exhausted from lives shaped by routine labor beside the Nile. Near the riverbank, fishermen returning from early work unloaded baskets of silver fish into shallow woven trays. The fish glistened in the sunlight while flies gathered quickly around them. One fisherman wiped sweat from his neck and looked toward the village. The roads already seemed quieter than earlier in the morning. Heat drove many people indoors or beneath shade until evening approached again. He preferred the river during these hours despite the brightness reflecting from the water. At least the breeze moved more freely there. Nearby, a boy sat repairing part of a fishing net beneath a palm tree. His fingers worked slowly through the tangled fibers while his head nodded occasionally with tiredness. He had risen before dawn to help launch boats into the Nile and now struggled to stay awake in the growing heat. The fisherman smiled faintly at the sight. Everyone in the village learned exhaustion early. Yet there was also familiarity inside the repetition. Each person understood the rhythm of the day. Morning energy. Midday weariness. Evening relief. Nighttime calm. As the sun climbed higher, insects buzzed lazily through the air above the roads. Dogs searched for shade beside walls. Donkeys stood nearly motionless with lowered heads while flies circled around them. Even conversation slowed during these hotter hours. People spoke less, moved more carefully, saved their strength for necessary tasks. In a pottery workshop near the village edge, heat from the kiln mixed with the rising outdoor temperature until the air felt heavy enough to breathe like smoke. The potter's skin shone with sweat while he shaped wet clay carefully between his hands. Rows of unfinished jars surrounded him. Some tall and narrow for storing oil. Some wide for grain. Some small enough for carrying drinking water. Each jar would eventually become part of another household's daily routine. Water carried from the Nile. Beer stored for meals. Grain protected from insects and dampness. Simple objects for simple survival. Outside the workshop, the afternoon slowly approached. The village roads had grown quieter now except for the occasional merchant or laborer still moving through the heat. Most children had disappeared indoors or into shaded courtyards. Palm leaves barely moved in the still warm air. Somewhere in the distance, a temple drum sounded faintly across the land before fading again into silence. The sound drifted over fields, roads, and rooftops, carried by dry wind from farther north. Then only the ordinary sounds remained once more. A broom scraping dust. Water pouring into a clay jar. A tired cough from behind thin walls. The endless small noises of village life continuing beneath the sun. Yet even during the hottest part of the day, many villagers quietly thought about the coming evening. They imagined cooler air drifting from the Nile. Darkness settling across the fields. Cooking fires glowing beside homes. Families climbing rooftops beneath the stars. The night always returned eventually. And with it came rest. Not perfect rest. Not complete silence. But a softer world than the harsh brightness of the day. As midday heat slowly spread across the land, the village seemed to slow its breathing beneath the endless Egyptian sky, waiting patiently for shadows to grow long again beside the river. By midday, the heat rested heavily over the village like a thick invisible blanket. The sun stood high above the Nile, bright and unmoving in the pale sky. Light reflected from walls, roads, water, and fields until the entire land seemed filled with shimmering warmth. Even the air itself looked tired. The busiest sounds of morning had faded. Workers still labored, but more slowly now. More carefully. Every movement demanded extra effort beneath the heat. Along the dusty roads, fewer people walked openly beneath the sun unless they had no choice. Most villagers searched for narrow strips of shade beside walls, beneath palm trees, or under woven coverings stretched across courtyards. Dogs lay motionless near doorways with their tongues hanging from the heat. Donkeys stood quietly with lowered heads. Birds disappeared deeper into the reeds along the riverbanks. The whole village seemed to breathe more slowly during these long afternoon hours. Inside one small home near the edge of the settlement, a farmer rested briefly beside a clay wall after returning from the fields. Sweat still covered his skin. Dust clung to his legs and sandals. His chest rose heavily with exhaustion while he drank cool water stored inside a shaded jar. The water smelled faintly of wet clay. For several moments he closed his eyes and simply listened. From somewhere outside came the distant scrape of a broom against stone. A child laughing weakly before falling quiet again. The soft creak of a loaded donkey cart moving through the road. And farther away, almost hidden beneath the stillness, the sound of the Nile. Even during the hottest part of the day, the river continued moving calmly beside the land. Its steady presence comforted the villages. Without the Nile, there would be no fields, no grain, no fishing boats, no cool water stored inside clay jars. The villages depended upon the river completely, and at midday many people thought about it longingly while trapped beneath the heat. Near the riverbank itself, fishermen rested beneath patched cloth shelters stretched between wooden poles. Their boats floated quietly nearby while nets dried in the sunlight. One older fisherman leaned back against a basket with his eyes half closed. The breeze from the water helped slightly here. Not enough to cool the skin fully, but enough to make breathing easier. Beside him, a younger man repaired tiers in a net damaged earlier that morning. His fingers moved slowly through the rough fibers while flies drifted lazily around the fish baskets stacked nearby. Neither man spoke much. The heat discouraged conversation. Words felt heavy in the afternoon air. Across the village, similar scenes unfolded quietly behind mud brick walls and shaded courtyards. Women prepared vegetables for the evening meal while sitting close to open doorways where faint breezes occasionally entered. Children slept on mats or played silently in shadowed corners too exhausted for loud games. In one courtyard, an elderly woman slowly peeled onions beside a sleeping infant. Her wrinkled hands moved steadily despite the stiffness in her joints. Nearby, damp linen cloth hung from a rope hoping to catch whatever air moved through the still afternoon. The smell of onions mixed with warm dust and smoke lingering from earlier cooking fires. The woman paused for a moment and looked upward. Above the courtyard walls, the sky appeared almost white with brightness. No clouds moved there. Only heat. Heat resting over Egypt exactly as it had over countless generations before. In a shaded workshop near the market road, a carpenter continued working despite the afternoon warmth. Sweat darkened the front of his linen clothing while tiny curls of wood gathered around his feet. Wood was valuable. Too valuable to waste precious daylight completely. So he continued carefully shaping a low stool ordered by a nearby household. Tap. Scrape. Tap. The sounds echoed softly inside the dim workshop. Outside, the village roads remained unusually quiet for this hour. Many people rested when possible until the worst heat passed. Even animals seemed reluctant to move. A skinny brown dog wandered slowly through the road searching for shade before collapsing beside a wall with tired eyes. Farther away near the fields, several farmers continued working because irrigation channels demanded attention regardless of the temperature. Water gates needed adjustment. Weak walls required repair. Crops could not simply be abandoned until evening. One young farmer stood knee-deep inside a muddy canal clearing blocked reeds by hand. Sweat ran constantly down his neck and arms while insects circled above the water around him. His muscles ached. His eyes burned from sunlight reflecting off the canal. Still he kept working. Ancient Egyptian life left little space for comfort during the day. Relief belonged mostly to the nighttime hours. The farmer glanced toward the village in the distance where mud brick walls shimmered beneath the heat. Somewhere there his family rested in the shade waiting for evening. He imagined the coming night already. Cooler air drifting from the Nile. Darkness spreading across the rooftops. The first stars appearing overhead. These thoughts help many workers endure the long afternoons. In wealthier homes, servants moved quietly through shaded halls carrying water jars wrapped in damp cloth to keep them cool. Some houses included small garden courtyards with pools or plants offering slight relief from the heat. Yet even there, exhaustion remained part of daily life. A servant girl knelt beside a large clay storage jar filling cups for the household while sweat gathered along her forehead. Earlier she had climbed stairs repeatedly carrying supplies between rooms. Her arms trembled slightly from tiredness now. She listened to the silence around the house. Only faint sounds reached her from outside. A distant hammer. The cry of a bird. Wind brushing softly through palm leaves somewhere beyond the walls. Midday often felt strangely suspended in Egyptian villages. The brightness slowed everything. Time itself seemed to move more heavily. Near the temple road at the far side of the village, a scribe sat inside a shaded room copying grain records onto papyrus. The small space smelled of ink, warm stone, and dust. Outside, sunlight blazed across the courtyard. Inside, the scribe bent carefully over the writing surface while trying to ignore sweat running down his back. His work required attention despite the heat. Numbers. Names. Deliveries. Measurements. The records of ordinary village life preserved briefly before disappearing into time. Sometimes the scribe paused to flex stiff fingers darkened by ink. Then he continued again. Outside the room, silence drifted through the bright afternoon air. Only occasionally did footsteps pass along the road. A merchant leading donkeys. A woman carrying water. A child sent on errands between households. Most movement remained slow and tired. Near the Nile, the water reflected dazzling sunlight into the eyes of anyone looking too long toward its surface. Reeds along the bank stood almost motionless in the still air. A few boats drifted quietly downstream while their occupants rested beneath cloth coverings stretched for shade. The sounds of the river changed during midday. At night the Nile whispered softly against the shore. At dawn it moved with quiet expectation. But under the harsh afternoon sun, the river sounded sleepy and slow, its movement hidden beneath the heavy stillness covering the land. As the afternoon continued, shadows slowly began lengthening again across walls and roads. Very slowly. Almost too slowly to notice at first. Yet villagers watched for these changes carefully. The return of shadow meant relief was coming. In one rooftop sleeping area now empty beneath the blazing sun, folded mats waited quietly beside clay jars and baskets. By nightfall families would return there once again seeking cooler air beneath the stars. The rooftops themselves seemed to remember the night even while burning beneath sunlight. Ancient Egyptian villages lived between extremes. Bright exhausting days. Soft restful nights. Noise and silence. Labor and sleep. The people moved through these cycles endlessly beside the Nile. Hour after hour. Season after season. Generation after generation. And now, as afternoon slowly leaned toward evening once more, tiny signs of life began returning to the roads. A child stepped outside chasing a rolling hoop through the dust. A woman swept sand from her doorway. Two fishermen prepared baskets near the riverbank for the coming night's work. The village was waking from the stillness of midday. Not fully yet, but gradually. Like the slow return of wind before sunset. Far overhead, birds circled lazily against the bright sky while the Nile continued flowing beside the tired land, carrying coolness, movement, and the promise of another peaceful night still waiting somewhere beyond the heat. As the afternoon slowly softened, the village began to breathe again. The sun still burned brightly above the Nile, but its harshest strength had started to weaken little by little. Shadows stretched longer across the dusty roads. The mud brick walls that had trapped heat all day now cast narrow strips of shade where children and animals gathered quietly. A faint breeze returned from the river. Palm leaves stirred softly overhead. And across the village, tired workers lifted their heads slightly, sensing evening approaching. Near the fields, farmers paused more often now. One man straightened slowly from his work beside an irrigation ditch and pressed both hands against the small of his back. His muscles felt stiff from bending over crops since sunrise. Mud dried along his legs where canal water had splashed against his skin earlier in the day. He looked west toward the lowering sun. Still hours remained before darkness, but already the land felt different. The terrible stillness of midday was passing. Nearby, another farmer filled shallow baskets with onions while insects drifted above the rows of plants. Their movements carried less urgency now. Workers no longer fought desperately against the morning schedule. Instead, the afternoon settled into a slower rhythm as everyone quietly endured the final hot hours before relief arrived. In the distance, the village shimmered beneath warm light. Smoke rose lazily from a few early cooking fires. Goats wandered slowly near courtyard walls. Children's voices drifted faintly across the dry air. The farmer listened for a moment before returning to work. Around him, the fields glowed golden beneath the lowering sun. Irrigation channels reflected strips of bright light between dark rows of fertile earth. Birds stepped carefully through shallow water searching for insects disturbed by human movement. The Nile remained nearby always. Even when hidden behind reeds or buildings, its presence shaped every sound and smell of the land. Closer to the village center, activity slowly returned to the roads. Women emerged carrying empty jars toward the riverbank before darkness arrived. Merchants rearranged baskets and goods outside shaded stalls. A potter stepped into the road brushing clay dust from his arms while examining the sky overhead. The heat still lingered heavily, but people could finally move more comfortably now. A young boy chased a thin dog through the lane while laughing sleepily. Earlier in the afternoon even children had become quiet beneath the sun, but evening always seemed to restore a little energy to the village. The dog darted around a corner and disappeared near a row of ovens where women had begun baking bread for the night meal. The smell drifted warmly into the road. Fresh grain. Smoke. Ash. Warm dough baking inside clay walls. For many villagers, these evening smells marked the true beginning of rest. Bread meant the day's hardest labor was ending. Families would soon gather together. Workers would wash dust from their skin beside the river. Darkness would slowly cover the land once again. Inside one courtyard, an elderly woman prepared lentils beside a small cooking fire while her granddaughter sorted garlic nearby. The old woman moved carefully because her knees pained her more in the evenings after long days standing and walking. Still, she preferred evening to every other time of day. The air softened. Voices quieted. The village felt gentler after sunset. Nearby, the little girl rubbed tired eyes while separating garlic cloves into small bowls. She had spent most of the morning helping carry water and sweep floors before resting during the hottest hours. Now she fought sleep while trying to finish her evening tasks. The grandmother smiled faintly when she noticed. Soon the child would be asleep beneath the stars on the rooftop above them. Outside the courtyard, sandals scraped softly through dust as workers returned from the fields carrying tools across tired shoulders. One farmer paused near the doorway and greeted the old woman quietly before continuing down the road toward his own home. Dust coated nearly every part of him. His clothing smelled of mud, sweat, and river water. The evening village was full of returning footsteps like these. Laborers, fishermen, builders, servants, all moving slowly homeward beneath the fading sunlight. Along the Nile, fishermen prepared again for the cooler night hours ahead. Nets were checked carefully. Boat ropes tightened. Baskets arranged along muddy shorelines. The river looked calmer now than it had during the bright afternoon. Sunlight stretched across the water in long shimmering bands while reeds moved gently in the returning breeze. One older fisherman sat repairing part of a torn net while watching birds drift low above the river surface. He worked without hurry. Night fishing required patience more than speed. Nearby, younger fishermen joked quietly together while pushing a narrow boat farther into the water. Their laughter carried softly over the riverbank, then faded. Even joy sounded calmer beside the Nile at evening. Farther upstream, several women washed cooking bowls beside the shore while children splashed nearby in the shallow water. The children's voices echoed brightly against the reeds before mothers called them back toward the village as darkness approached. No one wanted to remain too far from home after full nightfall. The ancient world beyond the villages could feel enormous once darkness covered the land. Desert stretched endlessly beyond the fertile riverbanks. Strange sounds traveled through the night air. Travelers relied on stars and memory to navigate distant roads. So as evening deepened, most villagers naturally gathered closer to home. Back in the settlement, cooking fires glowed brighter now. Smoke drifted upward between rooftops turning golden beneath the lowering sun. The smell of roasted fish spread through one part of the village while another carried the scent of onions and herbs simmering slowly inside clay pots. People spoke more softly during this hour. Exhaustion settled over everyone after the long day. Even conversations moved lazily. Near a workshop at the edge of the road, a carpenter finally set down his tools for the evening. Tiny pieces of wood clung to his clothing and beard while sweat dried along his neck. He stretched carefully, listening to the sounds around him. Children laughing. Bread ovens crackling. Distant voices near the river. A donkey snorting impatiently beside a cart. These were the sounds of the village releasing itself from the day's labor. The carpenter closed the workshop shutters slowly before stepping into the warm evening road. Above him, the sky had already begun changing color. Gold faded toward orange. Orange deepened toward purple. And little by little, the first stars prepared to return. On the rooftops, families began arranging sleeping mats once more. Some carried water jars upward before darkness fully arrived. Others spread thin linen coverings across the warm flat surfaces where they would rest later beneath the night air. One young mother climbed carefully onto her roof carrying folded blankets while her son followed behind holding a small oil lamp. From up there, the village looked peaceful. Smoke drifting upward. Palm trees darkening against the sky. The Nile shining beyond the houses. And everywhere, the slow gentle movement of ordinary life winding itself down toward night. The mother paused for a moment and listened. From below came the familiar sounds of evening Egypt. Clay bowls touching together. Neighbors speaking softly. A baby crying briefly. Footsteps fading along dusty roads. Nothing dramatic. Nothing hurried. Only people finishing another long day beside the river. As darkness spread farther across the land, the heat finally began loosening its grip. Cooler air moved through the village lanes carrying the scent of reeds and water from the Nile. Villagers breathed easier now. The hardest part of the day had passed. Soon the roads would quiet completely. The ovens would dim. The stars would fill the sky overhead. And once again, Ancient Egypt would drift slowly into the peaceful sounds of night beside the endless river. Darkness settled gently over the village. The final glow of sunset faded behind the western desert, leaving only a deep band of purple along the horizon before night fully took the sky. One by one, the remaining shapes of the fields, roads, and riverbanks softened beneath shadow. The heat of the day still lingered inside the mud brick walls, but cooler air from the Nile had begun moving through the narrow lanes. People breathed more slowly now. Even the animals seemed calmer. Along the rooftops, families gathered beneath the stars while the sounds of evening meals slowly faded away. Clay bowls were stacked beside walls. Cooking fires burned lower. Oil lamps flickered softly inside open doorways where tired workers rested after another long day beneath the sun. The village did not become silent all at once. Instead, it slowly drifted toward quietness. Near one rooftop edge, a father sat beside his young son while looking across the Nile. The boy leaned sleepily against him, fighting to keep his eyes open as stars appeared overhead. "Listen," the father whispered softly. The child stayed still. At first he heard almost nothing. Then gradually the sounds revealed themselves. Water touching the shore. Insects humming near the reeds. Palm leaves brushing together in the wind. A distant boat creaking softly somewhere along the river. The boy smiled faintly. These were the sounds of night beside the Nile. Sounds older than memory itself. Below the rooftop, the narrow road still carried traces of movement. A woman hurried home carrying folded linen beneath one arm. Two fishermen passed quietly toward the riverbank with nets across their shoulders. A servant extinguished a lamp inside a wealthy courtyard before disappearing back into the shadows. But each passing moment brought deeper stillness. The village was growing tired. Inside one small home near the market road, an elderly baker rested against a wall with weary hands folded across his lap. Earlier that day he had stood for hours beside the heat of clay ovens shaping bread for families throughout the village. Even now, long after sunset, the smell of grain and smoke clung to his clothing. His daughter cleaned the final bowls nearby while their grandchildren already slept side by side on woven mats. The baker listened quietly. He could hear neighbors talking softly beyond the wall. Their voices rose and fell like distant water. Somewhere farther away, a donkey shifted against stone. Then the sound faded into the darkness. The baker closed his eyes for a moment. Nighttime always felt peaceful after the endless movement of daylight. No more shouting across fields. No more hammering from workshops. No more blazing sunlight pressing against tired skin. Only darkness. Cooler air. And the slow breathing of the village. Along the Nile, several fishing boats drifted quietly beneath the stars. Lantern light reflected faintly across the black water while nets rested in loose coils near the fishermen's feet. One younger fisherman sat at the front of his boat trailing fingers gently through the river. The water felt cool against his skin after the long heat of the day. Around him, the world seemed enormous and calm. The villages along the riverbank glowed faintly in the distance where scattered lamps still burned near homes and courtyards. Palm trees stood dark against the starlit sky. Reeds whispered softly whenever the breeze moved through them. The fishermen listened carefully. At night, sounds traveled far across the Nile. A voice from another boat. Dogs barking from a distant village. The splash of fish beneath the water. The soft knock of wood against wood. The river carried all of it gently through the darkness. Back inside the village, mothers prepared children for sleep beneath the open night air. Linen coverings were spread carefully across rooftops still warm from the day's sunlight. Clay jars filled with cool water sat nearby beside folded blankets and baskets. One little girl asked sleepily whether the stars ever disappeared completely. Her mother smiled softly while smoothing hair from the child's forehead. "The stars always return," she whispered. The girl stared upward for a long moment before her eyes slowly closed. Above them, the sky stretched endlessly across ancient Egypt. Without bright fires or city lights, the stars appeared thick and brilliant overhead. Entire generations of villagers lived their whole lives beneath those skies, falling asleep night after night while constellations turned slowly above the Nile. Priests studied them. Sailors trusted them. Farmers watched them mark the seasons. But ordinary villagers simply rested beneath them in quiet comfort. As the hours passed, more lamps disappeared throughout the settlement. One by one. A flame dimmed behind a doorway. Another vanished beside a courtyard. Another faded near the market road. Darkness deepened gently across the village. Only the sounds remained now. Soft breathing. Wind through palms. Water against the riverbank. An occasional cough from inside a crowded home. The nighttime world belonged to small sounds. In one shaded courtyard, an elderly woman still sat awake beside a weak oil lamp repairing a torn fishing net for her sons. Her hands moved slowly through the fibers while the rest of the household slept nearby. The lamp flame flickered whenever wind entered the courtyard. Thread pulled softly through the net. Knot after knot. Careful and patient. This too was part of the village night. Not everyone slept immediately after darkness arrived. Some tasks waited until cooler hours. Some worries kept people awake. Some simply enjoyed the quiet. The old woman paused and looked upward toward the strip of stars visible above the courtyard walls. She could hear frogs calling faintly from the reeds along the Nile. That sound had comforted her since childhood. Even now, after decades of labor and loss and changing seasons, the nighttime river still felt familiar and steady beside her life. Near the edge of the village, two brothers lay awake on a rooftop after spending the day repairing irrigation walls near the fields. Their muscles still ached from lifting wet mud beneath the afternoon heat. Neither spoke for a while. They simply listened. One brother eventually pointed toward the Nile where moonlight reflected faintly across the dark water. "It sounds peaceful tonight," he murmured. The other nodded sleepily. Then silence returned again. Across the land, the deeper night slowly arrived. The roads emptied completely now except for occasional late footsteps near the riverbank. Even the dogs barked less often. Wind moved gently through hanging cloth and palm branches while moonlight silvered the rooftops and dusty walls. Ancient Egypt during these hours felt soft and distant from the harsh daytime world. The endless labor disappeared into shadow. The heat loosened its hold. People rested. Dreamed. Recovered. Near a storage building beside the fields, a guard remained awake beside a small lantern protecting sacks of grain from thieves and wandering animals. He leaned against the wall fighting sleep while insects circled around the weak light. Beyond him stretched quiet farmland beneath the moon. Rows of crops swayed faintly in the night breeze. Irrigation channels reflected pale strips of starlight. The entire landscape seemed calmer now. The guard listened to the night sounds carefully. Far away, jackals cried from the desert. Closer nearby, water moved softly through the canals. Then again, silence. The village behind him slept heavily beneath the stars. Hours continued passing gently beside the Nile. Clouds drifted slowly overhead before clearing again. The moon climbed higher. Night insects hummed steadily through the warm darkness. And across the rooftops, courtyards, and riverbanks of the sleeping village, ordinary Egyptians rested quietly while the ancient river flowed endlessly beside them. The deeper the night became, the softer the village sounded. By now, most fires had gone dark completely. Only a few weak lamps still glowed behind doorways where someone remained awake caring for a sick child, mending clothing, or waiting for a family member to return from the river. Everywhere else, darkness rested gently over the mud brick homes. The rooftops had become quiet islands beneath the stars. Families slept side by side on woven mats while warm wind drifted slowly across the village. Some children curled close against their mothers. Older men rested flat on their backs staring upward even in sleep, their bodies too used to years of labor to fully relax. From above, the village almost seemed motionless. Yet the night was still alive with small hidden sounds. A reed mat shifting beneath someone turning in sleep. The faint clink of pottery cooling after the heat of the day. A donkey breathing heavily in a courtyard below. The endless whisper of the Nile moving through darkness. These sounds blended together so naturally that most villagers no longer noticed them consciously. They belonged to life itself. Near one rooftop edge, an old fisherman remained awake while the rest of his family slept nearby. Age had made sleep lighter for him. He often woke during the deepest hours of the night and simply listened to the world around him. Tonight the air felt pleasant. Cooler than the previous evenings. The breeze carried the smell of damp reeds from the riverbank along with traces of smoke lingering from cooking fires now burned low. The fisherman closed his eyes. He could tell many things from sound alone. How strong the river wind was. Whether boats still moved nearby. Whether dogs barked nervously at strangers along the roads. Whether palm leaves swayed lightly or heavily overhead. Years beside the Nile had trained his ears as much as his hands. Far away, another boat creaked softly against its rope. The old fisherman smiled faintly in the darkness. Someone else was still awake on the river too. Below the rooftop, the narrow village roads lay almost empty beneath moonlight. Earlier in the evening they had carried returning workers, children, merchants, and animals. Now only occasional footsteps disturbed the stillness. A woman walked quietly toward the river carrying an empty jar. Perhaps someone in her home had fallen ill and needed fresh water. Perhaps she simply preferred the cool solitude of the riverbank at night. Her sandals brushed softly through dust as she disappeared into the shadows between buildings. Then silence returned again. Inside one crowded home near the center of the village, a young mother sat awake beside her sleeping baby. The child's fever had lessened since sunset, but she still worried. The room smelled faintly of warm clay walls, old smoke, and crushed herbs placed nearby to help the child breathe more easily. Outside, she heard frogs singing near the Nile. The sound drifted gently through the open doorway. She remembered hearing those same frogs as a little girl while falling asleep beside her own mother many years earlier. Even then, the nighttime village had sounded almost the same. The river. The reeds. The wind. The quiet breathing of tired people sleeping after long labor. So much of ordinary Egyptian life repeated itself across generations without changing very much. Morning always returned. Heat always returned. Night always returned too. The mother dipped cloth into cool water and pressed it gently against the baby's forehead. The child sighed softly in sleep. Beyond the village, the desert stretched silently beneath the moonlight. Its wide empty spaces seemed endless compared to the crowded warmth of the Nile settlements. At night, sounds from the desert sometimes carried surprisingly far through the cool air. The cry of jackals. The movement of distant travelers. Wind shifting loose sand against stone. Most villagers paid little attention to these sounds anymore. The desert remained part of the world surrounding them, just as the river did. But life itself stayed close to the Nile. Near the edge of the cultivated fields, a guard sitting beside stored grain lifted his head when he heard jackals calling faintly in the distance. He adjusted the cloth around his shoulders and stared into the darkness for a while. Moonlight silvered the irrigation channels nearby. The water moved slowly through them with soft, endless sounds. Rows of crops stood quietly beneath the stars, their leaves stirring faintly whenever the breeze crossed the fields. The guard fought sleep. His eyelids felt heavy after the long day. Yet he remained awake because grain meant survival. Entire families depended upon those stored harvests lasting through difficult seasons. So he listened carefully to the night around him. Water moving. Insects humming. The occasional creak of nearby palm branches. Then silence again. Back along the riverbank, fishermen floated quietly beneath the stars while waiting patiently beside their nets. The Nile looked dark and endless around them. One younger fisherman lay back inside his boat staring upward at the sky. He recognized familiar constellations above him, though not by the names future historians would use. To him they marked seasons, flooding patterns, weather changes, and directions along the river. The stars were practical companions as much as beautiful ones. Nearby, another fisherman adjusted a lantern hanging low beside the boat. The tiny flame reflected softly against black water. Neither man spoke. Words felt unnecessary during these hours. The river itself seemed to encourage quietness. Along the village rooftops, sleep deepened. Children sprawled sideways across mats. Older workers snored softly after exhausting days beneath the sun. A tired servant slept so heavily she barely moved when wind lifted the edge of her linen covering. Even dogs curled motionless beside doorways now. The ancient village had entered its calmest hours. No market noise. No hammering workshops. No shouting across fields. Only small nighttime sounds scattered gently through darkness. In one house near the ovens, an elderly baker woke briefly from sleep and listened out of habit. For decades he had risen before dawn nearly every morning to prepare bread while the stars still hung above the Nile. His body no longer trusted long sleep. Even now he sensed morning waiting somewhere beyond the darkness. Not yet. But coming. He turned slowly on his mat and listened again. A distant splash from the river. A child murmuring in sleep nearby. Palm leaves whispering softly outside. The baker closed his eyes once more. Soon enough the grinding stones would begin again. Soon smoke would rise from ovens. Soon workers would step onto dusty roads carrying tools toward fields and workshops. But the night still held the village gently for a little while longer. Hours passed slowly. Clouds drifted across the moon and cleared again. The air cooled slightly more before dawn. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called once from near the palms beside the Nile. Then quiet returned. Ancient Egypt during these moments did not feel grand or distant. It felt peaceful. Human. Simple. Ordinary people resting after ordinary labor beneath the stars. The river flowing patiently beside them exactly as it had for countless nights before. And above the sleeping village, the heavens turned slowly while darkness carried the tired land softly toward another dawn. The night settled softly over the Nile one final time. The village had grown quiet again beneath the endless stars. Cooking fires had faded into dim red embers. The dusty roads stood empty beneath moonlight. Palm trees swayed gently in the cool wind drifting across the riverbanks. Families rested together on warm rooftops. Children slept beneath thin linen coverings. Farmers breathed slowly after long days beneath the sun. Fishermen drifted quietly on dark water while lanterns flickered beside their boats. And through it all, the Nile continued its patient journey through the sleeping land. The sounds of ancient Egypt became smaller now. A distant splash along the reeds. Soft wind brushing mudbrick walls. The faint creak of a wooden boat tied along the shore. Then even those sounds seemed to drift farther away. The stars turned slowly overhead. Cool night air moved gently through narrow village lanes. Somewhere in the darkness, an oil lamp flickered once and disappeared. The village slept deeply now. No kings. No monuments. No great battles. Only ordinary people resting beside the river after ordinary days of labor beneath the warm Egyptian sky. And for a little while longer, the ancient world remained calm and peaceful beneath the soft darkness of night. The Nile flowed endlessly onward. The reeds whispered quietly in the wind. And the sleeping village faded gently into silence.